Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Leila Fernandez, Director of the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations and other Native peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, indigenous nations, and peoples across the world. I'd like to welcome you today to a continued speaker series for the winter quarter on protest, race, and citizenship across African worlds. I'm delighted to bring this program to you in partnership with the African Studies program that has really been the intellectual force behind organizing this, and also in partnership with the Center for Global Studies, Comparative History of Ideas, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Simpson Center for the Humanities, and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. Also, this particular lecture is additionally co-sponsored by the Department of History. I'm delighted today to first introduce my colleague, Stephanie Smallwood. Stephanie is going to both introduce our speaker for today as well as open up our Q&A by serving as discussant. Stephanie Smallwood is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Washington with a joint appointment in the Department of Comparative History of Ideas. Her research and teaching focus on the early modern history of slavery, colonialism, and race, with a particular emphasis on the transatlantic slave trade and on the development of racial capitalism and African diasporas in the Americas. Her book, Saltwater Slavery, A Middle Passage from Africa to American Diaspora, won the 2008 Frederick Douglass Book Award. She's currently at work on a project titled Africa and the Atlantic World, A Geopolitical History. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephanie. Stephanie, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Leila, for that lovely introduction. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speaker, Surayya Mohamed. Surayya received her BA from the University of Western Ontario and is now a PhD candidate in her final year, congratulations, in the program in Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, where she is a recipient of the David and Elaine Potter Cambridge Trust Scholarship and is also a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada doctoral fellow. Surayya's broad research interests include space and urban post-conflict reconstruction, contested memory and discourses of belonging after war, and the politics of knowledge production in the Horn of Africa. Her doctoral research examines post-conflict urban reconstruction and conflict-related property disputes in Mogadishu, Somalia. Her study engages debates on belonging in urban Africa and the aftermaths of political violence in cities, as well as offering an analysis of Somali politics that moves beyond the stale categorizations of anarchy and tribalism. Surayya has also conceived and produced with her sister Serero a podcast series called On Things We Left Behind. The series explores the hidden afterlife of war, taking an in-depth look at the lives of people forced to start over in the aftermath of violent conflict, and it was a finalist for UK's Launchpad competition. Surayya's talk today is titled Reconstruction, Reconsidered, Belonging and Urban Contestation in Mogadishu's Building Boom. Please join me in welcoming her to our Seattle and University of Washington community. Surayya.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you all for your time, and I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Surayya Qasim Mohamed, and I am a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. Today, I'll be discussing a few of the contours of my research agenda under this title, Reconstruction, Reconsidered, Urban Contestations of Mogadishu's Building Boom, So this project takes place in the context of an ongoing, anecdotally named building boom in Mogadishu, Somalia. The building boom is tied to the influx of diaspora since the ouster of al-Shabaab in 2011, which has led to a steady and tenuous reconstruction of certain national symbols, private homes, and public lands. So my doctoral research, as I came to understand it, necessarily became a project about this context of urban reconstruction. My doctoral research looked at the issue of conflict-related property disputes that emerges and situates and locates itself in this moment of reconstruction. And by conflict-related property disputes, what I mean is that some people had been gone from the city for 20 or 30 years and found that their homes and properties had been demolished or refurbished or just simply occupied by someone else, while others had stumbled upon a property and called it home for decades, only for someone with papers to show up and say that it's theirs. And this is the kind of puzzle that I was trying to investigate. In my dissertation, I argued that the politics of ownership in Mogadishu maps on in really important ways to claims to ownership of Mogadishu, and that the central question that orients how claims of ownership of Mogadishu are rendered salient is this politics of belonging, right? Just a little bit about how I got to this conclusion, what my actual methodology was. I conducted oral history interviews with individuals involved with conflict-related property disputes. I conducted semi-structured interviews with relevant intermediaries, politicians, notaries, attorneys, appointees to particular kinds of committees. And this talk today speaks about the context under which this doctoral work takes place. What does it mean? So to give you a sense of how we're going to organize our time, the first piece that I'm going to talk about is why theorize urban violence specifically. I'll move into a non-exhaustive overview of relevant parts of Mogadishu's political history. Then I'll introduce this concept, this really critical concept called urbicide, and how it shaped the contours of Mogadishu's urban war. And finally, I'll consider the logics of urbicide and its legacies on this contemporary ad hoc reconstruction. And then a couple conclusions. So first, why read conflict in the city? Why do this? Well, it's important to note that when conflict breaks out in urban centers, it comes laden with the spatial and historical politics of the city itself. So it's useful to consider how conflict in cities like Mogadishu is not just violence propagated over control of the city, but also violence made real through the material of the city itself. How the destruction of certain neighborhoods and not others, the erection and demolition of certain kinds of monuments and government buildings, the creation of war zones and spaces of relative peace, and the boundaries around which urban denizens can belong to the city, how these are all political processes that are deeply implicated and embedded in space. That is to say, conflict doesn't just take place in cities, it's shaped by them. And the very recent history of violence is unsettled, politically and physically. So as Roca and Boano argue, contested cities sit in this complicated relation to a web of, quote, contested visions with distinct consequences for the possibilities of urban living. And for our purposes, it becomes really important to understand that the only contest over the past is not just how to interpret it. It's also whose past and where does the story start, right? I really love this quote by Worth and Arias: where things happen is critical to know how and why they happen. With that said, Mogadishu, Hamad. The title of this slide speaks to different ways in which the city is named. Hamad being an affectionate term that denizens of the city use to describe it, right? Like I said, this is not an exhaustive overview. Any account of Mogadishu's past must first make sense of the ways that that past is used. Since the coming of state collapse, speaking of Mogadishu's present and future necessitates a conjuring of its past in some form or another. But to begin, it's hard to overstate the import of a city like Mogadishu when it comes to political imaginaries of the Somali territories. For the greater part of the 20th century, governance across large swaths of the Somali territories was conducted from Mogadishu. Whether this begins with the consolidation of Somalia Italiana in 1908 under the Italian crown, or decades later after the brutal colonial pacification campaign had run its course, a centralized administrative structure of Italian Somaliland oriented towards Mogadishu. And the post-independence unification of both British and Italian Somalilands placed even more of the Somali territories into the gravitational pull of the city. So thus, even considering the brief democratic interlude from 1960 to 1969, the outstanding spatialized centralization of power that characterized the early 20th century remained unperturbed, moving forward as if by inertia. The coming of military rule under dictator General Mohamed Barre in 1969 pushed the centralization of power in the city even further. The ideological shift towards scientific socialism made the state, quote, the prime architect of modernization, as Judah Pokonyi said, as development, progress, and modernity became bywords of the political salience of this time. And yet, the tangible outputs of these shifts was also most notable and marked in Mogadishu, where the schools, universities, and public services were themselves concentrated. So while gesturing to the whole of the country with this language of developmentalism, Mogadishu also became integral to the mythos of the national project while remaining profoundly unequal. So now moving into the closing months of 1990, the United Somali Congress, USC, armed militia had fought its way to the capital, and by early January 1991, General Mohamed Barre was deposed. But fighting only intensified with the ouster of the president as the USC splintered into two distinct factions who fought for control over the city and splintered the city into unequal halves. These zones of control led to widespread demolition across the Green Line that divided the two urban enclaves. The city continued to be re-territorialized along new axes over the coming of 3 decades. So there was the UN SLED, UN Peace Enforcement Mission, a series of warlord struggles for control, the rise of the Islamic Courts Union, the bitter fight between the Islamic Courts Union and the Ethiopian Army in 2006, the rise and fall of Al-Shabaab in Mogadishu, which takes us to the installation of the transitional federal government, which is backed by AMISOM, the African Union Mission to Somalia. So I just threw out a lot of terms there, but the main point that I'm trying to make is that all of these many reconstructions of order in the city were fought in and indeed through the city in important ways, right? So that's the central claim that I want to make. Thinking herbicide. An appreciation for the scale of the consequences of the civil war in the city can be found with an analysis that draws from the theoretical language of herbicide. Herbicide, or the killing of the city, has been a crucial theoretical instrument for understanding mass violence in cities such as Sarajevo, Mostar, and Beirut. Herbicide, theoretically, is about the fundamental dialectic between warfare and the city. Theories of herbicide invite us to consider the politics of the destruction of the built environment in its own right, asking what kind of spatial politics are enacted through urban conflict. And this could be characterized by the destruction of particularly symbolic parts of the city, or a reflection on how the mundane areas of the city were cleaved apart. So town squares and city halls and public gardens and hotels and dance clubs. I argue that herbicide in Mogadishu came into being with critically 3 interrelated processes: looting, boundary making, and clan cleansing. And I'll speak a little bit to each in turn. So looting was a key feature of urban destruction, particularly in the early phases of the civil war in Mogadishu, and it had a seismic impact on the built environment. Judah Pokonyi distinguishes between the looting carried out by militias and armed groups from the looting carried out by masses of people. Militias and armed groups looted the properties of enemies, organized exchangeable and sellable goods, organized rackets, and linked this kind of politics to global markets, right? Whereas the masses of people engaged in what she calls poverty looting, which is of food and medicine, leveling looting, which is about the properties of so-called privileged groups, and protest looting, which is about public goods, the looting of public goods. The critical distinction here is not just that the variety of kinds of looting take place at once, but also in the variety of political and social aims that they served. And if we consider looting to be a political act, which obviously it is in my view, this widespread looting comes to take on another valence. The forms of looting characterized by the general public demonstrate what one Mogadishian in my interviews characterized as a mass rage. Quote, "It was all rage those days for what was from before," right? And that these looting sprees were primarily targeted at symbols of the state and private properties of those deemed to have been unjustly enriched by the Barre regime is not surprising. Characterized by a, quote, "distinctly festive character," as Pokonyi says, these processes of looting were deeply political, as they engaged narratives of loss and humiliation. The looting accomplished something further than the simple destruction or theft. Through the dismantling of national symbols and government buildings, the destruction of records, and the occupation of particular kinds of homes, Mogadishu was made to take on a new form. Thus, the violence enacted on the city by its denizens can be read as a kind of political reshaping, a bringing low of the city as it was, and a simultaneous production of a new kind of city, one that was organized by different rules and arguably different rulers. Moving to enclaves and boundary making, I won't say much about this, there's a lot more to say, but I will say that with the coming of war came the reterritorialization of the city by armed groups into discrete enclaves of control, which were contested, diffused, and negotiated over the course of the violent conflict. The city became reshaped through the fashioning of distinct spatial boundaries, mediated by checkpoints, armed guards, and green lines across which movement was impeded. And so this is important, right? I want to speak the most about this piece around clan cleansing because I think it's really important. The most critical element of herbicide for Martin Coward, who wrote a whole book about herbicide itself, was what the destruction of the built environment did to, quote, the possibility of community or being with others in cities. So in Mogadishu, I argue that this came in the form of clan cleansing. Clan cleansing is a term coined by Lidwin captains to describe the propagation of violence in the opening chapters of the Somali Civil War. This shift to what she says is communal violence, which she says was perpetuated and suffered by people who shared geographical and social space as neighbors, acquaintances, and friends, was part of this key shift towards clan cleansing. It involved militia leaders employing and reifying what she calls clan hate discourses, which associated an ever-broadening group of people with the ousted Barre regime and were therefore marked for expulsion or elimination from the city. What Captain calls clan cleansing was an attempt at refashioning the city's polity to fit a new political spatial logic, one in which Mogadishu was conceived of as a space in which clan logic itself was the only credible determinant of urban citizenship. This created an urban homogeneity that continues to characterize the city. Clan-based political violence was used to displace the conception that all Somalis could claim a place in Mogadishu to live, to trade, and to govern in the capital. But to distill a cosmopolitan city like Mogadishu into a homogeneous form implies a severe sort of violence that disrupts a previous way of practicing life in the city. And this political violence that targeted both the city's inhabitants and the built environment that made those ways of living possible, right? So this is why Captains characterizes the violence of clan cleansing as what she calls, in very evocative language, a forced unmixing, as the texture of the urban itself was transformed through clan cleansing. As one urban elder put it in my conversation, he said, Hamad Allahun Haristo, which approximately translates to Mogadishu, rest in peace. However, it would be a mistake to think that herbicide entailed only destruction of Mogadishu wholesale. The paradox of political violence, as Broshdu argues, is that older ways of being find ways to endure as new orders are brought into existence, even if they're no longer the norm. This is what Broshdu calls the double valence of mass violence, which is both subordinating and producing, destroying and creating order. Through these many changes, a kind of Mogadishu was destroyed, sure, and another rose in its place, a different city riven through with different contestations and contradictions, rather. There were important demographic transformations in the city, as much of the middle class sought refuge elsewhere across the globe, and a consistent influx of internally displaced people sought shelter within the confines of the city. And all new kinds of urban denizens came to call the city home. And so now, I argue, the city and its futures are contested through this politics of reconstructing the city, with deeply emotive and symbolic consequences. And it's now with this kind of background in herbicide and this theoretical understanding that we can turn to this politics of reconstruction and the building boom. Processes of urban reconstruction after mass violence raise two main kinds of contestations in my mind, which are best framed as questions. What requires reconstruction, and who is reconstruction for? The first question responds to a series of contestations that surround the nature of the Civil War and what reconciliation means in the post-war political order. But the second question asks who belongs in the city and how new kinds of urban boundaries around the city can be drawn. And in this section, I argue that the city's process of reconstruction at this point has been ad hoc as a result of the multiple kinds of political inscriptions that are occurring through the built environment. That is to say that in Mogadishu, Urban reconstruction is not characterized by a standardized and regularized process, but instead through the initiatives of multiple kinds of actors, state actors, private individuals, armed groups, which make use of the built environment of the city in order to contest the past, the present, and the future. So in the course of this talk, I'll analyze this in two elements: cityscape and the politics of nostalgia, and contested ownership. But there's clearly more dimensions than I have the chance to get to today. So here, a small memorial stands on the bustling Kilometer 4 junction to commemorate the October 14th, 2017 bombing, in which over 580 Mogadishans lost their lives. There's no accompanying plaque or a place to reflect, as the blue column kind of protrudes from the center of the busy road, and auto rickshaws swerve around it in circles, as you can see is happening here. Apart from the small memorial, there's no other monument to evoke the violent events of the city that have taken place since the collapse of the state in 1991. In some ways, the whole city is that monument, right? The legacies of 3 decades of violence are inscribed in the notable ruins in the center of the historic city, in the protected compounds that ring fence entire neighborhoods, and in the armed controls that regulate vehicle movement every kilometer. But this doesn't mean that monuments have not been erected at all. You see, in early October of 2019, the federal government of Somalia unveiled a series of 5 statues in Mogadishu, all reconstructions of monuments that were destroyed over the course of the Civil War. These 5 statues, Nagahtur, Hawatako, the Somali Youth League, SYL, Ahmed Gure, and Sayyid Mohammed Ahmed Hassan, also known as the Mad Mullah, were all symbols constructed to glorify anti-colonial resistance. The original monuments, erected or refurbished over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, were part of this nationalist effort to construct a narrative of pan-Somali heroes that agitated across the Somali Peninsula and against many foes, the British, the Italians, the Ethiopians. The construction of these monuments in the 20th century served to invoke an all-encompassing Somaliness, Somalinimo, that at once both evoked the far reaches of the Somali territories, but also situated them in Mogadishu, the heart of the centralized state. Historian Safia Aidid incisively argues that public memorials in Mogadishu, etched in stone, quote, a set of meanings and significations in its negotiation of national identities and narratives, end quote. The destruction of these memorials occurred early in the course of the Civil War in the city through the kind of political destruction of cityscape. In many ways, the destruction of these memorials can be seen as a kind of counter-memory. But now, the memorials have returned to grace Mogadishu skyline. Is it possible that these memorials acquire new meanings in reconstructed form? One must consider that the reconstruction of these memorials signifies, when situated in a contemporary Mogadishu, a city much changed since the statues first dotted the urban landscape. The city around these monuments and their iconic buildings has transformed in really important ways. It's clear that the recreation of these particular symbols is an attempt to evoke nostalgic remembrances of the city as it once was, drawing a through line between the city before and after political violence. But this arguably ignores the critical demographic, morphologic, and political changes that have occurred in the city in the intervening years. But critically, when considered alongside the memorial for the October 14th, 2017 bombing, these reconstructions indicate an inability to articulate Civil War memory itself. There's a lacuna, a slippage, which moves directly from the post-colonial state to Mogadishu's reconstruction. And in many ways, Civil War memory is just simply too political, too presently contested in order to figure as public memory. The legacy of herbicide has been to make the 2 decades of endemic conflict rather unspeakable. So this is what I'm going to speak about next, very quickly, is the contested ownership in and of Mogadishu. This is the context in which my dissertation itself takes shape. Contestation over land and property are among the most divisive issues in contemporary Mogadishu, and these disputes stem from many sources, some of which significantly predate the conflict, but the public discourse around these properties is really, really deeply tied to the politics of herbicide. These land disputes tell us so much more than just simple material interests. I would argue that they're the manifestation of wider historical and social political contentions. And this creates a really interesting question as yet unresolved. Who has the right to reconstruct and under what kind of terms, right? So the widespread looting and displacement that occurred in the early phases of the Civil War to both publicly and privately owned properties opened up new relations of property ownership and use that significantly contrasted with the urban land and property use practices before the coming of state collapse. The processes of purchasing and registering titles in Mogadishu before state collapse was deeply bureaucratic, pushing the prospect of legal land ownership outside of the grasp of those of a well-connected and sufficiently wealthy elite. As well, the state often used national interest legislation, also known as Dangud, to reclaim certain lands and properties as a tool of punishment, politicizing land and property ownership further. So, combined with the exodus of many city dwellers and the arrival of new, soon to be urban denizens, state collapse effectively upended existing relationships of ownership within the city or to transform them significantly. I'll say that. So, I'll start with private land disputes, go through public land disputes, and then give some conclusions. Many private dwellings left behind by the old middle class of the city were put to use in new ways when the height of the urban warfare subsided, and some were converted into businesses while others were made into makeshift camps to shelter vulnerable displaced peoples, or others just simply used as private homes by new occupants. Private dwellings were sometimes sold to new owners with or without the purchaser's knowledge that the seller did not hold the original title for the dwelling. An entire section of Bakara Market was dedicated to the production of fabricated land documents, obfuscating the tracing of ownership relationships obfuscating the tracing of ownership relations before the outbreak of conflict, making a politics of paper verification a vital practice of legitimation and contestation. With many returning almost 3 decades after they left, the wave of diaspora has created a challenge to this new landscape of ownership. The administration of private property disputes has been a deeply contested issue in the city. There's multiple tracks of dispute resolution that disputants raise, sometimes concurrently, a customary process that can include clan elders, a quote unquote formal process run through the courts, the use of social media as a tool for publicity, as well as appeals to political heavyweights to influence ongoing dispute resolutions. The courts, I say quote unquote formal, as the courts became so enmeshed in these new politics of ownership and usage that when one land claimant was asked by me about the possibility of bringing her claim to court, she scoffed and remarked pointedly, "Am I crazy to bring it there?" By way of illustrative example, the Land Disputes Resolution Committee, called Guddiga Halin Taqilafatka, does not have access to the land registry of the city and must outsource its claims for verification to a third party. Unlike many other critical documents, actually, the urban land register of Mogadishu was not destroyed during state collapse, but instead it was taken into private custody by an enterprising individual who had worked in the relevant ministry at the time that violence broke out. And so this individual now effectively contracts claim verification to state authorities and kind of operates in a parastatal manner, as well as private individuals who have lost proof of their ownership, but for a substantial fee. Nor is the state the only arbiter of disputes. One of the central claims of authority to the Islamic Courts Union in Mogadishu was the functioning judicial system, which was specifically tailored to deal with land and property claims. That mantle has now been taken forward by Al-Shabaab, actually, who have inculcated a narrative of brutal efficacy in relation to the question of land and property contestations. So I'll quickly just go over the public piece and then we can wrap up. When a high-ranking official spoke about the process of reconstruction of the Prime Minister's office in the capital, he emphasized the delicateness of the process of negotiation. Within the garden in the Prime Minister's compound, directly outside the principal office, vendors had set up small shops. The official described that the status quo at that point was wherever the dawlad was, wherever the government was, you can easily occupy, even if it was the office of the Prime Minister. This sentiment that wherever the government was, you can easily occupy was a radical transformation from the history of the centralized state in the 20th century, where over a tenth of the properties in the capital were owned by the state prior to the outbreak of mass violence, making the government a quote major stakeholder in urban land management, according to UN Habitat. And these included functional buildings and factories, to be sure, but Also, state-owned buildings, state-owned housing developments, particularly designed to house the employees of particular ministries and their families. Some movement on the question of public land, quote unquote, restitution is appreciable, but only where it concerns the most vulnerable in the city. Over the intervening 3 decades since state collapse, internally displaced peoples have made and found shelter in the capital by constructing communities on public land, subdividing empty private homes, or in spaces that were previously left unconstructed for particular purposes. According to the Durable Solutions Unit, which has noted a stark uptick in numbers in the eviction of IDPs, which is appreciable over the course of a few years. The eviction of IDPs at this alarming rate is deeply tied to the building boom, and in my view, raises the critical question about who this reconstruction is meant to be for. And in critical ways, the politics of ownership in Mogadishu, as I've said, maps onto claims of ownership of Mogadishu in important ways, either legitimated through rightful usage or presence, through clan affiliation and territorial homelands, with claims underwritten by unspoken bonds of relative power, and with the capacity to press a claim through violence, thereby threatening to undo the tenuous peace that underpins the reconstruction process altogether. By way of conclusion, what does one make of this building boom? This return of the everyday in the show, which is characterized as shopping and leisure and banking and some basic service provision, has made an appreciable difference in the lives of those with an economic position to benefit, even if it is situated in the context of possible violence. And this means a great deal for those who make life and family in the city, as well as those who have traveled long distances to return. And yet the building boom is riven through with contestations and contradictions of herbicide. Reconstruction provokes particular kinds of uncomfortable questions, questions that can't be resolved by coats of paint or the reconstruction of spacious villas. Through the multiplicity of orders and authority, the uneven openness of whole quarters of the city, myriad processes of construction and destruction, the tenuous political order that makes this building boom possible, violence is inscribed through the political process of reconstruction in the city. And I argue that these contestations are spatial, but they are also mnemonic, memory. Paradoxically, it's through the systematic elision of critical issues about the meaning of the city, who and what it is for, and on what terms, that such contestations become emotively and politically charged in the urban landscape. And in this way, the building boom is not just dialogic to, but is productive of some of the same contentions that emerge from the legacy of herbicide. So thank you all so much for that, and I'm really excited for the next piece.
Wow, thank you, Sarer. That was such a fascinating and multi-layered presentation. I'm fascinated by the concepts that you presented, the concept of herbicide. And if I understand your project correctly, I feel like one of the things that you're doing so compellingly is making visible in a way that is hard to do the ways that various constituencies that have been locked out of power, locked out of access, are using this moment of reconstruction as an opportunity to be heard, to be seen, and to win in what is a long-standing battle for equitable belonging in the city. I have I guess a couple of, I'll try to frame two questions. My mind is spinning, but I'll try to frame two questions. One that is directly out of the talk, and another one that perhaps unfairly asks you to speak much more broadly. The first question, I'm just curious. I was really intrigued by the point that you made about the reconstructed monuments and the notion of this nostalgia for an earlier era of anti-colonial nationalism. And I guess as you transitioned from that discussion into your focus on the property disputes, I wonder if you see the property disputes as another arena in which some parties, on behalf of the state, on behalf of a kind of liberal bourgeois order, bureaucratic order, are also trying to kind of recapture a nostalgia for an older version of the city? So that's one question. And then the second question, thinking beyond the specificity of cities that have been shaped by the violence of war, I can't help but be compelled by the way your analysis of things like looting and rioting and just violence generally, particularly on the part of marginalized peoples in cities, speaks to much broader urban contexts. It's impossible not to think of our own city here in Seattle with respect to that, given what we went through this past summer, with a string of looting and urban violence as an expression of protest against racial policing. So I guess I'm just curious to know your thoughts as a specialist on big questions about cities, about belonging, where you see some of these things helping us understand these processes even beyond the domain of war-torn cities like Mogadishu.
Thank you so much for those really generative questions. That was
and one thing I forgot. I am supposed to tell the audience members, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A box that is visible at the bottom of your screen. Okay.
Thank you so much. Those were really great questions. So on the first question around the issue of, yes, nostalgia and this politics of nostalgia and how property disputes themselves can be about this kind of politics of reclamation, reconstruction. Absolutely. So there's this whole idea that I'm toying with or trying to think through about how understandings of new and old Mogadishans kept surfacing in my interview data over and over again, that often the claims to ownership over property were legitimated through narratives that specifically spoke to being an old Mogadishan, that defined in ways that were oppositional to different kinds of definitions. One kind of way of thinking about that or articulating that kind of claim would be a claim on this kind of general sense of belonging oriented kind of through autochthony, oriented through like the son of the soil politics, this kind of like original ability to claim the land under Mogadishu as your own, and therefore be able to claim the land on top of Mogadishu as your own as well. Another kind of series of claims, which I really love that you brought up, this kind of liberal bourgeois, because there is that kind of cosmopolitan politics that orients from individuals who kind of came through a particular kind of nationalist education in the 70s and the 80s, and were upwardly mobile and did have particular kinds of class relationships, orient or describe themselves as old Mogadishans through reference to their personal attachments and relationships to the city. But they were still bounded and exclusive. They were still, if you don't have those kinds of relationships to the city, if you don't have these kind of particular postures, perhaps if you don't have these kind of other linguistic trainings, or you didn't have an understanding of where exactly, how this road intersected with that road and who lived on the other side of that road, and those kind of social knowledges that came with being a part of those kinds of communities, that you couldn't claim Mogadishan status, right? And so the way that kind of played out in a really interesting way, there was an individual who, like, while I was having a conversation with them, was like just talking to somebody else. And so both of the individuals I was interviewing at the time, and they basically said, they were kind of just talking to each other. And one said, effectively, he was kind of coaching the other one. He said, like, if you are new to this city, basically, if you're one of us, if you're like the old guard, you know, this kind of urban, sophisticated group, you have to pretend like you've never been here before in order to live here now. It was kind of the argument. And that the other person was saying, yeah, I was in a Bajaj, which is those auto rickshaws. And he asked the driver to please take him to, like, basically he's asking to go to City Hall, right? So first he asked him, take me to municipio, which is the Italian word for the city hall. And the guy was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then he said, take me to Dola de Jose, which is lower government, which only makes sense in this context of a centralized state, that it would be called lower government, right? And the guy was like, what are you talking about? And then he was like, take me to Gobolka, which is like just straight up take me to City Hall. And then he like basically started the engine. He was like, cool, why didn't you say that in the first place? But like this, he was fuming. He was so upset that he's like, this kid, he's 25, he's 30, and he grew up in Mogadishu, and he doesn't know that that's what these things are called, right? That kind of bounding politics of like the knowledge of the city before is the only way to kind of access it. So yes, this politics of nostalgia is very important, and that's definitely playing out through these politics of disputes. On this question of yes, I actually rethought this entire section during the course of this year, because I wanted to think about what the use of the language of looting itself was suggesting, and what my political actual argument was, and where I was located in that conversation. And it was really helpful to me to kind of think through. So in my kind of placement of the politics of these urban transformations and reimagining what the city is through violence, yes, in this context itself, I thought of as a kind of important rebuke to ways in which those kind of politics were viewed as anarchic, without politics, entirely devoid of logic, just, you know, like, and that same kind of argument of basically Black people destroying their own thing without any understanding of what it is that undergirds that, and what the politics of rage, the effective politics with that space must be in order to bring about that context, right? And so in that important way, there's a huge through line, because the rage politics in and of itself is demonstrable. It's there in how people engage with the built environment, right? And so, but then I was having this kind of tension with like, the scholarship calls it looting. The scholarship is doing this thing of like trying to deal with this kind of thing in this way. Do I call it looting? Do I call it an uprising? Is that right? Is that true? But when you sit it alongside the politics of clan cleansing, then it takes on a different valence as well, right? Because these things are happening in tandem. And very, very quickly, the kind of public facing politics of rage against the state became also a public facing politics against people who were associated with the Bade regime, and then a wider and wider and wider definition of what that meant, including an entire clan family at the end, right? And so that becomes a really contested issue as well. It's like, how do you deal with that very live issue and violence as well? But without delegitimating its relationship to state oppression, which it was clearly in response to. So I don't know what my answer to that question is still. I'm still trying to figure it out. But yeah, it's definitely.
Well, I just think that the work that you're doing is just so wonderful in the way that it helps us. It gives us a language for understanding what are really innumerable threads of political agendas, and to help us understand something beyond, as you said, just violence or just looting or just rage, but all of it is having a politics and having a logic. Thank you. My task now is to turn the table over to Leela to facilitate questions from our audience. Leela.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for starting us off. And thank you for such a wonderful talk. I'm seeing just by the questions that the audience agreed with me. It was just really fascinating. So I guess I'll just plunge in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of the questions and try and do it in a way that's connected. So one of them is, I think, trying to build on what you're talking about when you're talking about kind of the affective politics of Reconstruction. You're talking about emotions and rage. And this question from one of our colleagues in the Jackson School is asking to just hear your thoughts more also about memory and the relationship between memory and place. And he says that the city is always a landscape of memory. What memories do you see elevated, and what memories are repressed in the process of reconstruction?
Wow, that's such a great question. Yeah, I think those are absolutely inextricably bound, right? And so when I think about that question, I return to this piece that I found really beautiful by Colombo and Schindel, in which they argue about the interrelation of space and memory in the aftermath of violence, generally as that space itself containing a series of haunting effects. The buildings, the scarred buildings, or the kind of spaces in which people move through themselves come to evoke the histories of violence that existed there, right? And so I think of these things kind of as a palimpsest, as like accumulating processes that don't begin or end in any kind of reasonable sense. And so what does this mean? It means that what my argument is that the ways that memory gets invoked in the politics of urban reconstruction is about this kind of critical contestation over different kinds of definitions of political victimhood that emerge from different histories of violence that happened during those interim periods during the 1991 through to actually 1988, excuse me, through to 2012. And it's about the kind of what the contestations of a memory do in this context is that, as opposed to other contexts in which there might be like a hegemonic state memory that kind of overrides competing ways of understanding violence, there's a surfeit of memory. There's a memory landscape in which there's not a lot of coordination and not a lot of agreement, but there are very live, very real issues that also are described, that discursively come to embody those things. So, for example, this issue of conflict-related property disputes that I study itself, in certain timelines or ways of describing or understanding the history of Somali political conflict, it's one of the most important critical features that people analyze and accept as one of the ways in which the war itself played out in Mogadishu. And in other timelines, it's completely avoided, right? And that comes through the interviews that I have, is that there's an emphasis instead on the colonial dispossession of particular communities, the construction of something that was called cosmopolitan, but never actually lived up to that ideal, the inequalities, clan-based as well as class-based, that characterized the time of military rule, and then the war. And that's that, right? And so it's not just about the rival timelines, it's also about how they're filled, how they're described, and how they're made sense of, and not just about who's which pasts or interpreting the past, but literally chronologically, where do you start? One of the first interviews that I had when I was doing this doctoral work was literally said to me, I know someone's clan by how they talk about conflict-related property disputes. Like just straight up like that, because there's such an attachment around this kind of discursive relationship to who's validated and who counts in these kind of conversations. I hope that answered that question.
Can you just, so I'm kind of taking the liberty, I'm gonna just skip the question for a while, ask you a little bit. Can you just talk, because your interview sounds so rich, can you just talk a little bit more about like the different kinds of threads you explored just in the actual interviews you did? Because there's just so much of what you're saying.
It was a great experience. It was, but so I had, like I said, oral history interviews with individuals from all sides who were going through conflict-related property disputes. So people who were complainants, people who had complaints lodged against them. And through these processes, one of the main things that I was trying to understand was like how they oriented this question of their specific conflict-related property dispute in wider questions of Somali history, but also the political history of Mogadishu and where how they understood ownership to latch onto that, right? And then I had semi-structured interviews in which I was kind of asking about the general processes of mediation and general process practices, and kind of trying to map out the landscape of these kind of disputes and who's involved and who isn't and what kind of things come up. So one of the things that I wish I had more time to kind of speak about was this politics of verification that kind of came through. So there was this basically parallel economy of the verification of documents that came to be really important in this kind of like process of dispute resolution, because even Al-Shabaab accepts state documents from before the Civil War as valid. Even though they don't conceptualize the contemporary state as the inheritor of that state, they think of themselves as a different thing. They still use those as valid registers of ownership. So they're one of the only ways that you can get out of these kind of discursive binds and move into concrete understandings of titles and deeds, but that doesn't make them less political, right? And so you often find, so there's an entire, like I said, section of Bakata Market that has the construction, like the creation of deeds and titles for a fee if necessary. And then there's individuals who locate themselves at important juncture points to kind of guide the disputes and be the verifiers. So verifying for the court that certain documents are legitimate, with this guy with the possession of the urban land register, for example. And he's actually got like basically a semi-formal role now doing that, because he just has the register himself. But then there's also the politics of individuals who have naqshads, which are basically planning maps of certain areas in the city. And so you can, and then there's the individuals who will take you to plots of land, right? And that's a whole different person. So, and that's, so you would have a specific land that's kind of blotted out on the piece of paper, on the map. It's registered to a specific plot number, and that corresponds to a place in the city that you may or may not recognize. You may have seen it last 25 years ago if you did, you know? And so the individuals who also mobilize bringing people there and back have an interesting kind of relationship to the city. So yeah, a lot of this kind of like ad hoc kind of entrepreneurial intervention kind of came up. But what I realized, it was kind of like the creation of different kinds of ways of thinking through public authority. I was saying that's what I was kind of thinking through in my dissertation. Is like, how does this connect to Christian Lund's idea that basically the way that states operate within property disputes is that they basically, by being the legitimators of rightful owners, themselves become more have authority. They themselves become the determiners, and that in and of itself is the construction of public authority. And I was like kind of thinking through how all of these individuals kind of like lining themselves up in different ways to do a piece of this work and a piece of that work, and kind of supplementing this, but also working against that, kind of creates this like fluid surfeit kind of ambivalent politics of governance of everyone and no one at the same time.
It's really interesting. And I'm going to ask one more follow-up, and then I promise the audience I'll go back to your questions. But
Sure.
So when you're having these interviews and you're dealing with this entrepreneurship and this negotiation, are these affective questions, or these questions of memories, are those kind of bracketed? Are they just kind of like invisible, kind of on the outside, or do they kind of creep in to, like when you're going to a plot of land, do you feel that affect coming through, or do you feel that the actors are just kind of occupying this like a modern actor model? I'm just going to, and then I'll go back to the question of the audience.
No, that's a great question. I don't know. I think it depends. It depends on how, like, it depends on what people's relationships are as well. Like, I think the people who are my age, for example, they don't have a reference point from before the war in order to kind of have an engaging conversation around how things are different, right? They don't have that kind of, it's been long enough now that it's the preserve of older individuals to kind of hold that kind of nostalgic politics. From my understanding and from my personal experience conducting these interviews, it's been seeping in. It seeps into how kind of people understand what counts as real ownership and what counts as fake ownership, or who are, like, the other piece is, who are the cheats that people want to tell you about? That's the really interesting thing as well. It's like when they want to characterize who's really messing up the system, there are specific kind of anecdotal places that people will kind of highlight over others. And that kind of betrays a particular kind of way of thinking through the city and its function and its political past as well. And so, yeah, it's not bracketed in the sense that there's like, if you're a functionary, if like your job is to take someone to a plot of land, probably in that interaction, you're not going to worry about this or that. That's going to be your primary focus. But during my conversations, it definitely started to come out, and there was a lot of kind of let me tell you the real story of what's going on here. Like, I'm not a part of this, but let me tell you the real story of what's happening here, you know?
Yeah, because so I think that is actually answering a couple of questions because people are asking about evidence of nostalgia and memory. And I think you're saying it was fleshed out when you were talking to them, but not necessarily in the formal processes.
Mhm.
You're saying. So building on that, one question from the audience is, what do you see as the role of urban planners in mediating the reconstruction of Mogadishu, particularly in dealing with making peace with the history of civil war?
I think urban planners. Okay, so it's I think it's very ad hoc at the moment, right? It's very ad hoc, and we're also starting from a particular kind of base in which uh, constructions of buildings were just made kind of in the beginning, in the middle of different intersections and roads and things like that, right? And so there were actually, during the course of this project, I worked really closely with an architect for whom this was a site of real concern and a site of real fear and real issues. But the role of urban planners, from what I've seen and what I've been able to glean, specifically works in particular kinds of spaces. In the Durable Solutions Unit, for example, at the Banadr Regional Authority, there are urban planners who are doing really fantastic work to create new kinds of, like, to make space for these individuals who are being evicted at large rates. And so they're experimenting with new kinds of community constructions, the creation of new kinds of neighborhoods, and there's an attempt to kind of do that. Um, the other piece, so this kind of talk was also pulled from a longer piece in which I also spoke about the politics of the cycles of destruction. So the spectacular routinized violence that Al-Shabaab meets on the city. And one of the things that I've also noticed was that architects also, or urban planners, would find themselves reconstructing the same home time and again, the same place time and again. In my dispute conversations, there was a conversation in which someone was basically argued that they had to basically give over the value of the house in cash, basically purchase their home again, because Al-Shabaab's explosion had destroyed the city, had destroyed part of the house, and therefore the reconstruction costs that the individual who was occupying the house were so steep that they had to be repaid for that before any kind of keys could change hands, in a sense. And so there are these kind of like spaces in which like technical knowledge becomes really important, but because there's this kind of polyvalent context, there's not like a sense in which there's going to be a right, this is what we're going to do about this issue, or right, this is what we're going to be able to accomplish, because it's just too contested.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's just, you clearly have such a rich ethnography of just the bureaucratic practices as well, in addition to everything else. So let me just add one more question from our audience, who's asking also whether like, what is the role of international actors in urban spaces, given that the ongoing conflict was both internal and also representative of proxy wars? Do these international actors still play a role, and what is the role of international capital? So lots of big questions.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that's something I want to do more research into in the future. From my understanding, a lot of this kind of, apart from the kind of, the landmark work, so the work of the reconstruction of the Somali National Theatre, Somali National University, those kind of nostalgic cityscape projects that I think of in that kind of term have a lot of external funding. The private property reconstructions that I look into are all like Somali capital that is there. I think one of the ways that this question of international actors in the urban space becomes really valuable to think about is when we think about Halane, which is like the airport compound in which international embassies and anything to do with the international community basically is congregated. Right. There's been a really great piece that just came out actually in Africa as a Country. It's called The Pearl of the Indian Ocean by Mohamed Scholar and Jibril Abdullah, which I highly recommend, in which they suggest that there are 4 parts of the city, right? And the first city that they mention is Halane. It's this self-contained space in which basically it's barricaded from the rest of the city. it's facing the ocean, so it has its own beach, but it doesn't have any kind of meaningful ongoing relationship with the rest of the city because of the security context. And there's kind of a periphery that extends beyond that, where they describe these beautiful villas and this kind of like hotels where like the Somali political elite and like Somali national organizations will kind of find their headquarters. And then kind of this other, the city 3, which is what they describe as where like low income residents will live. It's kind of further flung in the periphery. And then finally, the kind of IDP camps that are kind of on the outskirts of the city and subject to the most amount of everyday kind of violence. So like the international actors in a meaningful sense, in a day-to-day sense, don't have interpersonal experiences with the city. They have their own quarters. They have their own quarter of, and they kind of just meaningfully do their own thing. Where they become important is in the question of capital. And I would have to do a lot more research in order to be able to make an informed kind of answer to that.
Yeah, and just kind of building on that, one of the questions was asking about the rural areas. And I'm actually also, I wanted to just flesh out that question and ask, because is the city kind of just such a bounded space? You know, how does migration or mobility shape this? And is there scholarship like yours, which is looking at sort of rural reconstruction, was part of the question from the audience?
Oh, yeah. I don't know about a scholarship that deals with rural reconstruction in particular. So Mogadishu is interesting, like contemporary Mogadishu is interesting in that, so there's, as I was saying, kind of influxes into the city regularly when political violence occurs in other contexts or in other spaces. And Mogadishu becomes one of the spaces in which people find and seek shelter. Is the city bounded by space? It's expanding. It's expanding quite rapidly. And interestingly, it's expanding in the direction of both federal member states that surround the city. So one of the questions, the cyclical questions, is around Mogadishu's constitutional status and what exactly it's going to be in this kind of federal government and where it sits. Recently, Banadid, which is the area of Mogadishu and its environs, basically greater Mogadishu area, you could say, was recently had representatives added to the upper house of the Somali parliament, but it was an ad hoc kind of thing. There's no settled question around whether Banadid should be a state, whether Banadid should be ruled or governed in another way. But physically, the city itself is also expanding, and its environs are expanding into the territories of 2 other federal member states as well. So that becomes an interesting question around governance as well. Yeah, the question of migration and mobility, right? Influxes to the city happen quite regularly. And so there's questions around humanitarian disbursements. How do individuals get or access aid? And yeah, and I think there's also the question around, there's also a huge politics in Mogadishu of gatekeeping aid. And that's something that's not as prevalent in other spaces. But that's just the case there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I hope we're not exhausting you too much, but there's a whole series of questions taking you in a different direction. I think that your talk has been so interesting that people have all kinds of different angles. So there's a whole series of questions about diasporic communities and sort of memories of the city. So for example, stereotypes about Mogadishu as a destroyed, violent place, and how does that inform members of the diaspora, you know, as they move back and forth, as they or as they return, is one example. Are there, you know, class dimensions which affect that? So a lot of different questions about diaspora.
Yeah. So diasporic politics in Mogadishu is a huge question. I think something up to 2/3 of parliamentarians have a foreign passport, as does both the president and the new prime minister does too. Yeah, so it's not unheard of for diaspora to have an outsized reach and control in levers of power. And so this kind of question of like diaspora versus non-diaspora also becomes a really interesting question when it comes to interfacing with intergovernmental organizations, because linguistic skills also becomes a huge part of that, and being able to manifest or demonstrate a particular kind of politics of expertise that a lot of people use to leverage their relationship to the outside for personal gain becomes an interesting thing. And so there are tensions that surround that politics and those ways of orienting in the city. When it comes to stereotypes about Mogadishu as a destroyed or a dangerous place, there's this interesting tension that arises that kind of speaks to, there's the discursive depictions of Mogadishu as this anarchical place, this anarchical, excuse me, and like it's a place riven with anarchy. Yes. I don't want to get into IR theory now. It's a place riven with anarchy. Meanwhile, there's also these kind of attempts to portray a vision of Mogadishu as a rising city, in which these conversations around the building boom also take a huge kind of surface place. And I think in 2013, the World Bank president said something along the lines of Mogadishu's building boom is proving that it's going to take its place in a reconstruction. It was like a whole series of images. And a lot of the, especially, I mean, I'm speaking generally here, but a lot of the young diaspora like myself pull this kind of language. They surface this kind of language of this rising city, this beautiful city, and it is a beautiful city, on the beach, particular kinds of ways of creating images of the city as rising. The context of not past destruction, but contemporary insecurity and violence, though, does change people's understandings, or does kind of make people sit uncomfortably with those narratives of the rising city, right? Just this week, there was an attack and basically an invasion of this hotel called Hotel Afrique, in which a number of people unfortunately lost their lives. A couple lost their lives who just got married there. An individual who worked for this durable solutions unit that I was telling you about actually passed away. And so this kind of routinized spectacular violence also does damper that kind of rising city narrative. I think the binary between a city in anarchy or a failed city and a rising city itself is questionable. I think instead we can kind of think of this place as a contested city. And so we can enjoy what's beautiful about it and understand that that's gate kept and accessible to only some of us. Yeah. And that we can also understand the deep history here, which has its beauty and has its challenges. But yeah, I think having a more nuanced kind of approach to the space means that this kind of like, we're not a failed city, we're a rising city. It's not particularly useful.
Yeah, and we don't want to get too much into IR theory, but I think what you're doing is you're also challenging the ways in which failed state, there's been a narrative about failed states, and one of the solutions has always been the reconstruction of the capital city. And the World Bank example, I think in some ways is part of your answer to the international capital question, because you're sort of showing that nexus through your ethnography. But I wanted to just link your answer to another specific question from our colleague Danny Hoffman, who's also asking about just linking your discussion of diaspora to your position as a public intellectual, because I know that you're doing this podcast with your sister. And if you could just reflect a little bit about why that matters to you to speak to audiences, internationally, and also in relationship to your location as in terms of a migrating intellectual as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. So the podcast itself was an opportunity, I think, to explore other sides of the same question, if that makes sense. Sitting with individual narratives told in the first person and through the medium of audio is an interesting kind of way of addressing some of these kinds of questions without speaking about them in such an overt way, right? And so I think some of the same kind of contestations come up, questions around memory and its fleetingness, but also it's not about like memory in this kind of huge way, it's memory in the individual sense and like what people's individual ways of interpreting or understanding their world is, and then like kind of like making space for that. I think for us, one of the things that was important with On Things We Left Behind was to we didn't have ethical approval to go through in order to create the podcast, but we did follow many of the same kind of bedrock principles that you would when you're doing field work, which would be effectively having conversations in which consent was foregrounded. And so we were trying really hard not to sensationalize the stories that we were hearing. If we had individuals recounting particularly dramatic episodes, we would often put them in this third quarter of the episode itself, so that way you have a sense of an interpersonal relationship with the individual. For the same reason that I think narratives of Mogadishu can be really spectacular and make it seem like a place in which human beings don't live, experiences of warfare can do the same thing. And so they can be incredibly alienating and make it a sense in which what you're listening to is a tragic sob story, as opposed to individuals talking about making decisions and having agency and being put in really difficult contexts under really difficult constraints, but trying to make sense of how they navigated those intersections and what they made sense of. And so in that way, I think the work that I try to do in my research and the work that I'm doing in my podcast have that kind of similar core. It's an attempt to kind of make sense of this,
Yeah.
make it make sense in some kind of way, and try to offer something of an analysis if it was on a different register.
Yeah. No, that's deeply thoughtful. And so it's hard not to follow that up with one of the questions, which is also then asking about how that, I don't know if you've had a chance to teach much, because I know that you're so busy with all the research you're doing. And but if you have taught, is the dynamic different with students? So for example, the question is, a lot of, for example, Western students who just look at the conflict from afar, filter it through mainstream movies. Like one person has mentioned Black Hawk Down as like the
Sure.
as the metaphor,
or Captain Phillips, or yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know, have you taught much? Have you been able to have do much teaching about related to your research?
Not about my research, unfortunately. So I hope I do have this question one day to kind of overcome or to deal with or to contend with. Yeah, I think I've taught, but just not on courses that kind of would relate to this. It's like a globalization and development course and like introduction to political science and things of that nature.
Yeah. So So hopefully you'll get a chance too, because you're just so thoughtful in the way in which you're discussing these issues. So we have a bunch of questions more. I'm trying to conflate some of them so that it's
Sure.
more so I package them. But one question is someone is asking, what does moving beyond Reconstruction look like to you?
Oh, wow, what a great question.
Yeah.
Okay, so funnily enough, there are very valid academic arguments that could be made that the way that I'm framing this whole thing as post-conflict reconstruction is a phase in which the show has yet to enter, right? That a lot of the theoretical kind of understandings are like the city isn't settled enough, the state isn't settled enough in order to be able to actually engage these questions yet, right? And so there's this teleological understanding of what basically spaces post-conflict pass through, right? And then you have your post-conflict phase, and then you have your transitional justice phase, and then you have your democratic output phase. And the understanding is that Mogadishu or Somalia writ large is kind of stuck way over here, and it's not doing what it needs to do in order to kind of move along. And because I've been contending with that kind of series of thoughts, I haven't actually had a lot of time to think about what the after of Reconstruction would mean or look like. So for me, I think the first thing that I would say is that conflict in and of itself, even if you go through these kinds of remedy processes, reconciliation processes, processes of repair, ostensibly especially through these kind of mechanisms that are ostensibly meant to do that, because of the legacy of the politics of those kinds of violence and histories, I think they have a way of enduring as a part of the kind of palimpsest that I was kind of describing earlier. Not that conflict is immutable or that you can't escape it, but that the questions that the violence brings require different kinds of ways of answering it, and then it's almost an incomplete answer in many different ways. And so there's a sense in which a continual ambivalence around who the city is for, regardless of how that question is resolved, is going to be a question that we're asking ourselves for quite a long time. So I don't foresee a single planning initiative or a single series of kind of transitional justice remedies kind of overcoming these issues. I think they will transform these questions into new forms, and those will be the basis through which those kinds of conversations are contested. But I do think that there is a kind of one of my interviews used the term constructive ambiguity to speak about how the politics of Mogadishu was happening now. Is that because there isn't a sense in which a side won, and because there also isn't a sense in which individuals have the ability to kind of, there's just too many different kinds of moving parts, and there's too much governance into so many different spaces, that because of that, there is a kind of settlement that originates from that space, that there is a way in which people can kind of make life and make lives that work as a result of that. People are still exposed to violence. People are still exposed to a lot of different things. I said a lot of ways of saying I don't know what post-Reconstruction looks like, but those are the kind of ways that I would think about imagining what that could look like.
Well, you know, it's really interesting as you're talking, because there's a tendency, so I'll be a little polemical, but there's a tendency, for example, within disciplines like political science, to see countries in the global south or in post-colonial countries according to that teleology. But I think if you think of just the insights of what you're bringing to the table in relationship to racial justice in the United States, there's a lot that we could learn in the United States about, you know, the need to interrogate that teleology even within so-called advanced or advanced industrialized or richer countries within the West, in terms of memory, in terms of, you know, the legacies of violence, which kind of get reinscribed in cities. So I think there's just a lot that you're speaking to. So we have a few more minutes, and if you'll bear with us, because we do have a few more questions. A lot of the questions are laced with just high praise, which I'll say I won't read all of them. I'll just kind of say that. But there are a group of questions which there's just kind of a hunger to hear more about your ethnography and interviews. Okay. And I think I'll take the liberty of just asking you a specific dimension of that, which is of my own interest, which is, you know, you talk so much about urban space and you know, affect and sort of the process of reconstruction and sort of living in these cities. And I wanted to hear more about sort of issues of embodiment, and particularly in terms of gender dimensions. So how is that kind of reconstruction of space, like that spatialized politics and spatialized reconstruction, how does that kind of like play out in, or does it play out in gender terms? And did you see that in any of your interviews or not?
Yeah, I mean, well, this isn't in the interview. This is just from my kind of feel of the space. So I think one of the things that would be really important in thinking about embodiment is about this question of like the politics of militarized masculinity that orients how people move through the city in and of itself, right? And so the politics of checkpoints and navigating through these kinds of spaces, having to demonstrate proof of a rite of passage, and to individuals themselves who are wearing different colors of uniform with a large weapon in and of itself, like the kind of charged atmosphere of militarized masculinities and the different kinds of militarized masculinities that you encounter. So in the city, it's like basically the Somali police force or others who are kind of doing that work. But as you approach Helena, which is this kind of intergovernmental hub, it's the kind of self-isolated international world, if you think about it like that. It's actually AMISOM and UN, it's AMISOM soldiers who are doing that work. So generally from Uganda or Burundi, who are navigating those checkpoints. And so this is the airport compound. So in order to access the airport itself, you have to move through those kinds of spaces. There's a sense in which like that task has been handed to more, I don't know, capable hands, maybe the implication, I don't know. So yes, so that's one sense in which there's definitely a gendered component in how people experience this. Then there's of course how generally women move through different kinds of spaces, and I haven't done enough research to be able to speak about this in an interesting way. I will say, for example, though, that moving into Helena for the first time, moving into international world, there's a different dress code for me as a diaspora outside of Helena and inside of Helena. And so there's this kind of tension that a lot of diaspora that I know who've been there kind of experience and explain as like it's a disorienting moment of passage from one space to another, because especially as a woman you have to dress in a specific way in Somalia. But the international world isn't that way anymore. And so it's a disoriented moment of passage from one space to another, in which all of a sudden it's your Canadian passport that matters, not your Somali one. And it's your English that matters and not your Somali. And it's your jeans that matter and not your abaya. Like there's interesting kinds of like that in that space. I've noticed that as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, thank you so much for patiently answering so many questions. I'm sure that the audience agrees with me. It was just so, it was such a terrific and rich talk. And I think with your answers, I think we could probably keep you for another hour, but I think, but we are almost out of time. So I just want to end by just thank you so much, Shuray, for spending the hour and a half with us and for sharing your wonderful research with us. And thank you to the audience for your terrific questions as well. So with that, I'll conclude the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.